Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to the Sounds of Film. And I'm very excited to have on the program today filmmaker Maren Poitras. She's the director of Finding the Money. Finding the Money follows American economist Stephanie Kelton on a journey through modern money theory, or MMT. I'm really excited to talk to Maren about the movie and also about the concept of modern money theory. Maren, thank you so much for joining us today on the Sounds of Film.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, this movie is very interesting, very thought provoking. Maybe for our listeners, though, who don't really know exactly what modern money theory is, I was wondering if you could give us just a little background and then why you wanted to make a movie about it.
Yeah, so good question. But it basically it's this kind of smaller, what they call heterodox group of economists who came together and kind of colloquially became known as modern money theory, or were kind of deemed given that name. And they were questioning some of the maybe foundational assumptions of mainstream economics, really starting from the premise and centering this understanding that the federal government is the issuer of the currency, the US dollar. And it's really that kind of basic observation that everything follows from. And they say, maybe that observation has not been fully integrated yet into our mainstream economics textbooks. Especially when we talk about things like the national debt and government borrowing and interest rates and all of these things. Really, the nature of money itself. Where does it come from? So it gets into all of that from the somewhat simple observation that the federal government is the issuer of the U.S. dollar, and yeah, so the story kind of flows from there. And then the reason I really found it, even though I come from more of a background in climate and in environmental science and trying to understand these big picture issues of climate change and inequality. And maybe how we can tackle some of our big pressing challenges. And we always run up against, I guess, money and kind of that question of how are you going to pay for it, or economics itself as kind of, maybe pitting the environment against jobs, or, kind of we can't do something to help the environment if that's going to hurt the economy per se, even though, I was always confused by that dichotomy that was created when they seem very integrated, really. So when I found this kind of small group of economists that were saying some bold things, that were saying, some of the foundational assumptions of economics may be inaccurate, that really just kind of drew me in, and gave me this different, things started to click, and it was a very circuitous route for me. But when I found this group, pieces of the puzzle started to fit together in a different way, and I really wanted to understand if what they were saying was perhaps correct. So I did want to go out and talk to them and to all the economists that I could from across the political spectrum to really dig into this story, and yeah, try to see what I could find in terms of the understanding where money comes from, the nature of money, in terms of really understanding what we can afford today in terms of our biggest challenges, and what how we think of what's affordable, and budgeting in a different way, I suppose. But we can get into those details.
Yeah, early on in the film, you show some people who acknowledge that when you start to talk about this nature of money and where it comes from and the true way that it works, some people will say you're not supposed to talk about that. There seemed to be like this hesitation by some economists to say it out loud, or a fear that if you talk about this, there might be some danger. Can you explain to
Right.
our listeners why is it dangerous to say that we just print our money and that we can keep on printing it?
Right. Well, there's a few, yeah,
Yeah.
there's a few things going on, and really just, where does money come from, and the nature of money itself. So there's a few things there, and I think sometimes it's yeah, in the film I try to make light of it a little bit, that it's a little overly dramatic, but it's true in the fact that you don't the question around where does money come from is not thoroughly covered in economics textbooks and 101 textbooks. I went back to look at all the textbooks I could find and see, where do they talk about, step one, what is money and where does it come from? And it's usually about a paragraph, that says, oh, first we had barter and that was inefficient. So we invented money, and the market invented money and make things, trade more efficient. So clearly, yeah, it just evolved from there. So, it's just kind of this fairy tale almost that, first there was a market system, like there's this kind of idea of the supremacy of the private free market. And I think that's really this core story or almost core ideology that so much comes back to, and why it's very almost revolutionary to just simply say the federal government is the issuer of the currency, because I think what it gets down to at the end is, mainstream economists maybe don't want to talk as much about the role of government in the economy. They really want to place the market at the center, right, as this kind of central force and power. And so I think in a way that's why we don't want to talk about it, and in a way it's also, it's not integrated into the models. The models that economists have often don't even include money, let alone like the banking and finance sector. So their models are almost like, these complex extrapolated barter system models, like taking out money from the whole equation. And so you do wonder, if any of their, predictions are going to be useful, that are coming out of these models. And so, and when you find, digging into the evidence, I just, you want theories to be built on empirical evidence and data first. But it just seems to go the other way around with economics often. It's the ideology or the theory first. And then if the data doesn't fit, well, the data must be wrong, So I think, that sometimes questioning, these foundational assumptions means you're questioning almost the whole field. And that's why it's very unnerving for them to maybe talk about it, or want to go there, because, right, you're opening a can of worms, or you don't want to go down that path, or, think too hard about that, because then you might, things might stop making sense, might not be as coherent as they appear. And so I think that's why many of the economists maybe I interviewed for the film, and I was really trying to understand, they were almost able to hold, contradictory assumptions in their mind at the same time. Like this one is not, on the one hand, they'll admit, the federal government does print the money, or, issue the currency. And then on the other hand, but, it has to borrow, or it has to, it could go broke, or we have this thing called the national debt, right? And so how do you square those two assumptions? And that's really what the film is about. Does it make sense that the federal government has to pay back a debt when it's the issuer of the currency? Who is it borrowing from? Where do the dollars come from in the first place? And if you start to try to untease those threads, it becomes dangerous to the field of mainstream economics, I would say, or the current ideology, especially of free market, the kind of free market fundamental ideology, I would say.
Was there more of a sense on your part when you either interviewed some economists or found some clips of different economists talking on the subject, that they just didn't want to talk about it? Or I got the impression with some of them that they didn't seem to really understand some of the points that you were making in the movie, or that they just didn't have an easy way to explain what they were
Mm-hmm.
thinking. I mean, what's going? I mean, it seems shocking that some major economists just wouldn't be able to understand some of these concepts that you present in the film.
Right. And it's not so much that they wouldn't be able to understand. I think it's just that it's not in the textbooks, right? Or it's not what's been presented to them. And it's not a question that they have been asked before, or that they've asked themselves, right? And I think, so, just kind of alluding to the one question I asked in the film was, if the federal government's the issuer of the currency, why does it need to borrow? And so that question just isn't addressed super well, I guess, in the textbooks, nor is often talked about. And so that's what's really illuminating to me, because maybe I set out in the film to say, how could it be that mainstream economists, even though the MMT economists are saying, the mainstream is maybe missing some things and getting some things wrong, those are some bold statements that they're making for an established field, and so I wanted to go out and try to find out for myself, could the mainstream be missing something, or is it that they know and they just don't want us to know, where the money comes from, let's say. And so when I went to go speak to people, I was trying to dig a little deeper into that myself. And what I think I found was that no, I mean, people are honest, and these economists were kind of honestly grappling with the questions that I presented that maybe just hadn't been presented to them before, right? And just hadn't and aren't covered in the textbooks super well. So I think that's what it comes down to, is just we could have a better, more accurate understanding. Like we just haven't really updated the textbooks to integrate, especially, either going off the gold standard or really how things have been for a long time. Since the Constitution, right? The Congress has had the authority to issue the currency. So this is how it's been set out, and the monetary system we have is really just a set of rules and laws that we humans have written. And so it always seemed confusing to me why we couldn't just go to the law books and say, okay, here's how it works, instead of having a bit of mystery around it and so much confusion. And so I think what the MMT economists are trying to do is simply dispel some of this confusion and have a clearer picture and a clearer image of how our current monetary system operates in reality, based on the system that we ourselves have created. And so it just shouldn't so much be a mystery. But for some reason, right, the mainstream economists, there's all this conflict and controversy where the mainstream says, oh, don't listen to the MMT economists, they're crazy, and crackpot, this is a crackpot theory, even though they're trying to say, no, we've done the research, and we've looked at the laws, and we looked at the operations at the Fed and the Treasury, and then follow the balance sheets, and we properly account for all the dollars out there, and how the Federal Reserve and the banking system works. And yet, I think I've never found the thing is, when I went out to speak to the economists who do critique MMT and say that it's wrong, I was never persuaded. I could never find someone to give me a good critique that says, this is what MMT says, and this is where it goes wrong. They could never say, in their operation of the monetary system, this is incorrect, and I can show you why. No one ever got there. No one ever actually took MMT, I think, seriously enough. They never, they kind of critiqued the straw man description of what MMT is colloquially known for in the public, which is, oh, we can print infinite amounts of money and nothing bad will ever happen. It's like, that's not what they say. They say, of course, there are limits. There are real limits. There are inflationary limits, real resource limits. But we're trying to be clear-eyed around how our monetary system works and what the real limits are, and how we could actually better, more responsibly budget from the federal government and budget our real resources. So to prevent inflation and hopefully to prevent, more ecological disasters. So I think what I was really hoping to find was someone who could give me one of those, a good critique on the level of, of detail that MMT goes into when they describe the current workings of our monetary system. And I just couldn't. I have yet to find that. And I think the MMT economists themselves have yet to find. They've been asking for 30 years. Prove us wrong, show us where we go wrong, and no one's really been able to give them that answer, to show them a valid critique. But I think everyone is open to it,
Well, one of the stars of this movie, and probably the person who can speak most clearly on the subject, is from Stony Brook. Stony Brook University is actually featured in this film, and I think a lot of people will find that interesting who listen to the program. But Stephanie Kelton is really the leading voice, along with a number of others who are trying to educate people on this topic. Tell me about why you decided to focus so much on Stephanie and what she does.
Yeah, no, great question. And I think, right, she's not exactly the person who founded this theory or, came up with all the ideas herself. Of course, it's really kind of a group effort. And in the film, we show some of those various economists, starting with Warren Mosler, who's now down in the Virgin Islands, and others who kind of independently started coming together around these ideas. And again, they even went back and showed how, for centuries, these ideas have popped up in different literature and from different, even well-known economists such as Adam Smith and Abel Lerner and many others. And yet Stephanie, comes along and I think is really able to just communicate these ideas more clearly, right? And so she's become, the face of the theory of the group. She's the one who's able to talk to journalists, to get on TV. And so, of course, she's the easy one to go to for a documentary, because you need someone who can just kind of translate, communicate these wonky, sort of things for a general audience. And that was my hope, was, to bring what could be, a very esoteric subject, but one that I really think affects all of our daily lives so much that, especially as voters in a democracy, I think, so many of these economic decisions decisions, that we're told are maybe we assume they're natural, inevitabilities, and there's not that much we can do to change, oh, the rich are just going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer. But I think so many of these economic decisions are really political decisions, or economic, they're real political choices that we need to make as voters in a democracy. So I think we need to understand, what our options are, what the trade-offs are. And so I hope this story, is relevant and translatable for a very general audience. And Stephanie is the one who can kind of hold the audience's hand through these slightly more complex ideas. And she's great at that. And she's been workshopping, the language and the talking points for decades. So, it's great to have someone like that who can, participate on camera. And maybe she wasn't super excited to be on camera all the time, but I think, luckily she ended up, giving us enough of her time that we could really put together a more complete picture, hopefully. So yes, very appreciative of that and her time, and all of her efforts over the years, and especially at Stony Brook now.
Yeah, I thought she did a great job. One of the things that, I mean, I'm not an economist. I don't know that much about this topic overall, but when you hear sometimes people from different political backgrounds talk about their fear of inflation, they start bringing up other issues, which were not really addressed in the film. I was wondering though if you could just, because I'm sure you hear a lot of these things brought up when people watch the film, maybe.
Hmm.
People have questions about when we went off the gold standard. Um,
Hmm.
like people will, like, again, I don't know how true this is. It sounds like from the movie now that maybe it wasn't that big a deal, but some people seem to think that the dollar used to be backed by gold, and that our problems began when we no longer did that, when there was a change. Now
Right.
watching this
Yeah.
doc, I always hear that, and
Right.
now watching this film, I'm wondering, is that not true?
Well,
Is
good.
it, So, what's the problem with that thought?
Right, and it is a very common. I think it's very ingrained in us to think of, okay, money should be gold or should be real. It should be this tangible thing of value that we can touch, right? And I think that gives us more confidence in it, let's say. And it's very deeply ingrained in us, right? That money is gold, and there's just kind of this gold story, that goes deep. And so, I think it is, yeah, it's very easy to point to 1972 or three, whenever it was when we went off, 1971, when we went off the gold standard. Nixon, of course, it's not like we had been on the gold standard for all of history prior to that. It's really actually more of an aberration when nations are on the gold standard versus not. I think it's a common misperception that most nations throughout history have always been on a gold standard. And it's really more rare than it is common, because every country will go off it. We went off at World War II, the Civil War, World War One. All these times when there's any kind of national emergency, we go off the gold standard. Or if there's, yeah. So I think what's interesting and what's important to think about is, is it the gold that was giving the dollars or the money value, or was it actually, the government establishing the price for gold in dollars? So it's actually a little bit the other way around, right? The government said, we will pay $32 an ounce or whatever it was for gold. We'll pay this. And that doesn't mean the gold stock is determining the value of the dollar, right? The government said, this is the price of gold, and stop. And so what that meant was, yeah, anyone who digs up gold can get that many dollars. But when you think of it on a societal level, and of course, this does restrict government spending, but it's almost arbitrary in the way it restricts it. Why restrict spending to the quantity of gold you have? I mean, you could restrict it in any other way. Today, we have something called the debt ceiling, which is also this kind of arbitrary limit that we set for ourselves that we always have to raise, because it's not helpful, right? It's not really a good metric of our real limits or our real limitations as an economy, as a society, in terms of our general real resources, right? And so I think the important thing to understand is that, yes, we are limited by real resources and inflation, but those are kind of a complex phenomenon that we should be analyzing much more before we do any spending. But I like to think of it as, let's say you have a society, a community, and you want to build more hospitals and train doctors and nurses, and you realize, you have all the resources you need to do that. You have the bricks and the mortar and the construction workers and the doctors and nurses to train. You just need to kind of put those together and start working to provide, healthcare for your community. At what point do you need to go send half those people to go dig up, this shiny metal out of the ground, refine it, do a bunch of environmental damage, make it into blocks, and then bury it back in the ground at Fort Knox? And somehow that process is going to help you build the hospitals and train the nurses that you need, to provide for your community. So it's not the real resource that we need to do the things that we want as a society. Like gold doesn't really play in, gold is important in, fillings and in high tech industry, sure. So we need it as a commodity, but as thinking about money as a commodity is not often helpful in terms of a societal perspective, right? If we're zooming out and looking at what are the real resources we have as a society and what limits us. And I think, importantly, this applies not just to the US, but to really any country in the world, and thinking about, developing economies, right? Or global South economies, they're so often told, oh, you're poor. You might have real resources. You might have all these minerals, you have this land, and you have all this unemployed labor of people who want to work. So you have all those things, but you don't have money. So, you can't use any of the things that you have. So you have to borrow dollars, you have to borrow euros to do anything. You have to go into debt, let's say. And that's just not exactly accurate. If a country has its own currency, if it taxes in its own currency and enforces that taxation, then it's able to spend and able to hire unemployed workers to, let's say, grow more sustainable food on your land with your resources. A country in Africa doesn't have to go borrow dollars in order to hire a farmer to grow more sustainable food, right? And I think that applies in a lot of ways when we think about the real resources we have as a society, as a nation. That money is not the scarce resource itself, right? That goes into that. Money is really the organizing tool of the real resources that we want to coordinate in our society. So yeah, it's a different way to think about it.
There's so much there. I have a million questions, but one just going kind of back to some of the people that question about gold. I think they also have questions about the Federal Reserve, and I was wondering, just can you explain to our listeners what exactly the Federal Reserve is? How do they figure into everything that you're presenting in this movie? And is there any truth or not to, again, I'm not an expert on this, to when people will say the Federal Reserve is not, I don't know how they phrase it,
Yeah,
it's not really a
public-private.
part of our government, that it's a private
Mm-hmm.
bank and
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff.
Perfect. Yeah, no. And again, you're bringing up great, like really common misperception or misconceptions. I wouldn't say, but very common perceptions, let's say. And I myself, was trying to understand as well in the beginning because it is so common. But no, the Federal Reserve is best thought of as the bank of Congress's bank, basically. So Congress creates this central bank in 1913. Before then we didn't have one. We still issued our own currency, but so we just had treasury. So we create the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and we do have. So there's always a grain of truth, in I might go so far as calling it a conspiracy, the idea that the Federal Reserve is a private institution in a way, but there's always a grain of truth there, right? Because, number one, all you have to do is go to federalreserveboard.gov. It's a government institution, right? It's based in DC. It's .gov. Its mandate. It was created by Congress. It's a creature of Congress. It reports to Congress. It puts back any profit it creates back to Congress. So yes, it is completely. It does not have power over Congress, let's say. And it's not. It's independent insofar as they get to set the interest rate. So Congress kind of said, okay, we're trying to make this a separate body. They set the interest rate, and we're actually going to give them the role of managing inflation and unemployment. And the only tool they have to do that with is the interest rate. So there's a lot of issues there that we can get into, but just going back to the public-private idea, um, so that there are some private, shareholders in the regional reserve banks. There's different regional reserve banks in San Francisco, about nine of them, I think. And so that was, harkening back to when this was created in 1913, to really help provide, these regional um, banks and prevent another, prevent recessions or depressions. That was
Yeah.
why they were created, to be able to provide liquidity to all these banks. It was a very complicated monetary system we actually had throughout the ages and in the 1800s. Very interesting stuff, and you can really go into that history and see how banks were issuing their own currencies as well, basically, their own different types of notes. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as call them currencies, but different notes. And so the Fed had a lot to do to coordinate. Of course, they didn't really succeed in preventing the Great Depression, right? And I think, similarly, we can see in 2008, the Federal Reserve, the central bank itself, does not really have the tools it needs to address big recessions and depressions. The thing is, the Federal Reserve has the authority to lend, or to I forget, or to yeah, to lend, or to do like these things called asset swaps, purchase assets. But they cannot, create, and they do not spend the money. They're not authorized to say, we're going to create this much money and we're going to give it to you, let's say. That's really Congress's job. So Congress has the authority to, really decide on it's, creating new money, or basically, spending more money. And at that moment is really when dollars are created and they're spent and they get delivered to people in the economy, right? So Congress will say, you know what, we're going to spend this many more trillion on defense, and this much more on healthcare, and this much more on education, and those dollars start going out to teachers and soldiers and hospitals and that sort of thing. And so Congress has the authority to spend, right? And where that money goes. The Fed can't say, oh, you know what, I think you've spent too much, Congress, you've spent too many dollars. We're going to say, no, you can only spend this much. So number one, the Fed always, their job is always to clear any check, any payment that is authorized by Congress. That's their first job. They run the payment system. They do all this other stuff. They ensure that, banks have enough liquidity. They help run our payment system, and so and then they regulate banks as well. And the hope there, they do have more room to, I think, deal with inflation with some other tools they have in their tool basket in terms of bank regulation, the bank regulation side of things, and credit creation actually that's happening there. But the interest rate is such a blunt tool. So we can get into that as kind of a separate question, but hopefully
Yeah.
that starts to unravel your question. Long story short, the Fed is a government institution.
Maren, are you concerned at all, as I think some other people are, about some of these other nations around the world who are saying that they're no longer going to rely as much on the US dollar? Like, I was trying to take in everything that I learned in your movie, and this is not really addressed necessarily in the film, but I was trying to figure out, like, based on what I learned from your film, will this make a difference? There's some people that make the claim that one of the things that props up our dollar, even when we're going into debt, is that it's used worldwide, unlike
Hmm.
other countries' currencies. People trade oil and stuff in it, and that everyone wants dollars. But if all of a sudden a bunch of BRICS nation countries were going to stop relying on the dollar as much, based on what you've learned, would that make any difference in our system or not really?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do think it would make, it does make a bit of difference because, of course, like MMT doesn't, it's not like it only works if you're the reserve currency of the world, let's say, which is sometimes a common critique, that this only applies to the US because we have a reserve currency or something. But no, so it applies to any country that issues its own currency, and then it describes what other kind of currency arrangement you might have, right? There's kind of this whole spectrum of what you might call monetary sovereignty. Um, and so, on one side you have the US, but that's also the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, these types of countries. And then you have, on the other hand, maybe the euro, where you have a monetary union, or the CFA franc in West Africa, or you have Ecuador that's completely dollarized. They don't have their own currency at all. And so MMT describes all those situations, whether you have a floating exchange rate or a fixed exchange rate. And it shows you kind of what, on the scale of monetary sovereignty, what is your flexibility? What is your ability to spend as a nation? What are your policy choices? And so the US does have a bit of extra room, right? We have extra room to spend because basically the constraint is, what the government can afford technically to buy, whatever is available and for sale in dollars. And the fact that a lot of people are willing to sell things for dollars is an advantage for us, right? And so we do have the ability just to spend more, to acquire more resources, because other people are willing to save dollars, to acquire dollars for whatever purposes they might want to use them for. And so, yes, we do have some privilege from that, clearly. And I think that other nations, have similar privileges, but it doesn't change, our ability to, what we can also do at home, because we have tons of resources, here in the US as well. And so even if we're not used as, let's say, the international reserve currency, it wouldn't change things too fundamentally. We might not have quite the amount of abundance that we do today, in a way. And again, this might be a better question for some of the economic experts, but yes, it's a very, it's a valid question and a common one, but it doesn't change, kind of the fundamental understandings of MMT. But yeah, there is this understanding of, really so much that's behind our currency is political power. So yes, that does affect things a little bit in terms of just what are the real resources that you can acquire as a nation.
One of the things that's really fascinating in the movie is the discussion about taxes. And man, people have to watch this movie. But I was wondering if you can explain some of the comments made by some of the people in the film, where they're basically like, they almost kind of imply that your tax money that comes in is not really needed. Like they could just burn it, or they do burn it. I guess maybe just metaphorically, um,
Hmm.
but I think without seeing the film, that a lot of people listening to this wouldn't even know what I mean by that. Can you give us a
Yeah.
little sense about how there has to be this balance between what's printed and what's out circulating in the economy, and the reason that we tax, but that even when we tax, it's not really needed. It's a little confusing.
Right. Right. It is confusing, and that's why I made the film.
Yeah,
Right. And so I think,
and people should
yeah, it's kind of
watch
like you
it.
need to,
People should
right,
watch it.
because you do. Right. You need to understand the pieces of, the pieces of the puzzle kind of fit together. And it is a little shocking to just hear, oh, they delete or they burn your tax dollars when you collect them. It's like, what?
Right.
Because that just changes, we're always told, oh, the government really needs our tax dollars to pay, to feed a hungry kid, or to do this good program, or to, help, pay for education and healthcare. Well, in a way, I'm not trying to say that they don't need tax dollars, right? So the tax system is very important, but the order of the operations is different than what we think, than what we assume, right? Because if you start from that premise, that the federal government's the issuer of the currency, the dollar, just going back to day one, let's say square one, where would the government get this thing called the US dollar to begin with, right? They say, oh, all of a sudden we're a new nation, and in order to pay for stuff, we have to collect taxes in dollars. And everyone looks around and they say, oh, well, we don't have any dollars. What are dollars? So, so it can't necessarily come from people, from households, from their basements, creating dollars so that the government can collect them in order to spend. Right. So once you're, it's kind of this different evolution of a tax system. And through that evolution, really, that's when money is created, right? And that's why we go into some history in the film and show some historical examples to wrap our heads around the relationship between, really the taxation system and the development of the monetary system itself and money. Because the thing to remember, and that I want to accentuate, is that the government doesn't need your dollars in order to, let's say, feed a hungry kid, but they do need to collect there does need to be a widespread tax system. So kind of the order of operations is the federal government is able to impose a tax liability, let's say, on a population, and say you are going to owe us taxes. But then the government has to spend first, right? They have to spend the dollars into existence first, before anyone can then have the dollars to pay their taxes. So it's kind of the last step where the first step is the tax liability or imposition of a tax. The government has to spend, the dollars circulate, and then that's the only way that people are willing to work for dollars, right? To do labor, to build the roads, or to build the hospitals and schools, or to sell goods to the government, produce things for sale for the government to acquire real resources. And so, really, the tax system does provision the government with real resources. It ensures that things are for sale in the currency of the nation. So it ensures that things are for sale in dollars that the government can then purchase. And then the last step is, it has to collect those dollars back, a certain percentage, in order to ensure that, this is what they call drives the currency. So it ensures that people are willing to use the currency. You have to have this tax imposition. And then that serves to really kind of like start this whole engine, this whole motor of resource transfer, and really creating a monetary system and a market itself. I think it would be hard for me to imagine, a market system really going until you have the tax system and the monetary system in place. Then before you can really have a market and have the rules and laws that a market requires in terms of preventing theft and punishing things like that, and enforcing private property. So that this goes all the way back to like where we started, kind of the story of money and this idea of, does money evolve from this kind of natural free market, or is there something a little more political, where we're creating societies and civilizations, and really through that process of trying to move resources, trying to produce and distribute resources, through that process, money is invented by political forces. Let's call them sometimes states or governments or emperors or religious authorities. And it's through that tax system really that the last kind of much later in that story, our market's able to finally develop. So I think it's a little bit different than the story that's told in the textbooks, where the market comes first. So this story starts differently, and the market kind of comes last. And that for me, that's an interesting revelation, in order to show really just kind of who has decision-making power, and kind of where we want to decide how we could organize our societies differently in terms of like producing and distributing those resources, and for what goals, for the goals of societal well-being, human well-being, and environmental sustainability. We can choose those goals. It doesn't have to be these kind of, the market just has these powers where it has to grow, and it has to just kind of chew through humans and chew through the environment, because that's what it has to do.
Yeah, and
So
if
yeah.
we could end on that, I know you come from an environmental background, and I was kind of surprised at first how, I mean, you really delve into all these economic issues, and then you seamlessly kind of work in this message that you kind of just alluded to, which is that because of the way the market is, people should be able to feel comfortable doing the things that we as a society need to do to fight, climate change and other important things that need to be addressed. Can you tell us why that was important for you to include that idea in the film?
Yeah, definitely. And again, it kind of comes back to where I started. And I think, sometimes I think even to summarize it differently than it is in the film, what excites me about all of this as well is just, understanding in a different way what's affordable in society, because we're always told, oh, this climate spending or this environmental spending is not, we just don't have the money, right? We're in debt, it's a terrible burden on our grandchildren, so we can't afford to restore this forest, let's say, and prevent wildfires. But when you budget, when you look at the federal budget a little differently, you can say, when you again realize that we should be budgeting for real resources, really as our limits, our real limits, rather than the dollars we have, you see that the dollars are the organizing tool, right? Then you can see that we have something called the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and they analyze any new spending. But all they do is analyze it to say, how many dollars will this add to the debt or the deficit? And that's really all they tell you, and that determines, whether this legislation might get through Congress. But I think what could be happening differently is, number one, any new spending should be analyzed for its inflationary potential, right? And that's always linked to real resources as well, and our capacities there. And so what we could be doing in order to budget, I think, more effectively and more responsibly would be to say, what's the inflationary potential of any new spending and its real resource use? Because then we could see that some spending, might cost a lot of dollars, but it doesn't cost a lot of resources, right? So that could be spending, on climate spending, or spending that restores forests and fisheries and wetlands, this kind of ecological restoration or that sort of thing. It may cost a lot of dollars, but you're just hiring people who are maybe unemployed, hiring labor to restore real resources that enhances our real resources, our real wealth. I think we could see that kind of spending should be deemed much more affordable than maybe some other spending that maybe even looks like it doesn't cost a lot of dollars, but does cost us a lot of real resources, like just continuing the kind of fossil fuel infrastructure that we have. It also helps us see, that maybe private profit isn't necessarily a sufficient metric for determining if something should get investment or funding. That in a world where we have limited resources, in a world of inflationary limits, inflationary pressures, that maybe we do need to be prioritizing, where dollars are going, where that investment is going on a societal level. Especially, this is why I bring that banking system into the film as well, and understanding how banks really are creating credit in a way, creating new money when they're making loans, making investments, making loans to fossil fuel infrastructure projects. Are they not, so this gets into a whole other thing. If we understand that in a way they're really extending the public credit that's been established, they're able to create money giving loans based on the fact that they've been chartered by the federal government. They're not like kind of spending the dollars that they saved themselves, and it's their private money and they get to do what they want with it, like invest in fossil fuel projects. No, they're really extending the public credit in a lot of ways from the federal government. Then we can see, maybe we do need to put more restrictions on the private side of the balance sheet as well, in terms of all these, this kind of credit creation that's happening. If we're analyzing the federal government spending, rightly, for inflation potential, which we should be doing, analyzing any new government spending and keeping them on a budget. Well, what about the private side of the economy in terms of their spending, which can also cause inflation and real resource use? So should we also be looking there to tamp down inflation, prevent inflation from starting to prevent, these climate calamities that are really going to be the leading cause of inflation in the future, right? I mean, there's just no way we can avoid inflation pressures, price spikes from when we're having shocks to our agriculture, to food, to oil and energy shocks. Those kinds of things are going to be definitely hitting our pocketbooks, right? And so how can we prevent that to have a better functioning, prosperous society that really, does rely on our natural resource base at the end of the day. So yeah, it's kind of tying all those things together is a bit of a goal. But I think hopefully the film is just like that short intro that starts us on this path to have these different discussions about what we can afford and really what our goals for our economy and our society are.
So, Maren, where can people go to see this movie, Finding the Money?
Yeah. So it is available wherever you rent or buy movies now on demand. So like Apple TV, YouTube, Amazon, Fandango at home, Google Play, yeah, all those types of places. And then also Canopy. Canopy is kind of a streaming service that's available through universities or public libraries. So yes, please do look it up. Apple TV is a great one to just rent or buy. I might recommend buying it because you might want to watch it more than once anyway. So just
Do,
go ahead
do you have a
and get it.
social media place you want to send people to, or a website?
Yeah, definitely. So our website is findingmoneyfilm.com. So it has all the links for where you can watch, and we still have some, theatrical screenings happening that pop up around the nation. Sometimes we continue to schedule those. We already, and you can also sign up if you'd like to do a community or educational screening, in your community or at your university. So just, go ahead and contact us on our website there at findingmoneyfilm.com. We're also on, Twitter and Facebook at like Finding Money Doc. So yeah, great to follow us there as well. And as we continue this work, or following, Stephanie Kelton is active on Twitter. It's even part of the film. So I think, social media is an important place where these debates are playing out in these discussions.
Well, Maren, I want to thank you for coming on the program, and I want to highly recommend that people seek out Finding the Money. A lot to think about here, and you did an incredible job making what could be a complex subject interesting and I think easy for people to understand if they sit down and watch the film. So thank you very much, Maren, and I wish you the best.
Great. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, really enjoyed talking and hope to talk again soon.
Sounds good. Take it easy. Bye bye.
Bye.